This video was made possible thanks to Bellroy. Check out the link in the description for 10% off anything on their site. And if you want to watch an extended cut of this video with full-length solo clips, you can find that on Nebula. On May 7th, 1964, even a spring rain couldn't stop some 200 young blues enthusiasts from piling into an abandoned rail station outside Manchester. They were there for the taping of a television special called Blues and Gospel Train. After an opening trio of songs performed by Muddy Waters and Cousin Joe, a heavy downpour interrupted the show. When the rain finally gave way, a horse-drawn carriage brought out the gospel legend Sister Rosetta Tharpe. Tharpe strutted across the platform and picked up her Gibson SG. She proceeded to tear into a passionate performance of Didn't It Rain, highlighted by a jubilant solo. 3 months later, this performance was broadcast across Britain to an estimated audience of 10 million viewers. It was the continuation of a series of blues tours that had been capturing the British imagination throughout the early 60s. These tours saw a who's who of blues greats display American music to eager European audiences. Along with Tharpe and Waters, the list of blues players who went on these tours includes T-Bone Walker, John Lee Hooker, Howlin' Wolf, Lightnin' Hopkins, and more. As impressive as those names are, they would soon be overshadowed by the young guitarists who were in the audience watching. Jimmy Page, Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, Keith Richards, and Brian Jones are among the names who attended these shows. In the next few years, these budding musicians started recording careers, and the electric guitar solo went international. What followed was a cross-pollination and cultural exchange as British and American musicians traded innovations back and forth across the pond. This cultural conversation would revolutionize the solo and completely reinvent the electric guitar as we know it. One of the earliest successes of the British blues revival scene was the Rolling Stones. They formed in 1962 around a mutual love of American blues and started to record immediately. Before long, they were one of the most beloved bands in the UK. Inspired by their blues idols, they decided to try their hand at touring across the Atlantic. But unlike Tharpe and Waters' tours, the Stones' first US tour was a disaster. American audiences had never heard of the band, and they were thoroughly unimpressed by their British take on the blues. Even the king of cool himself, Dean Martin, mocked their hair and performance.
That'd be great. We're going to leave right after the show for London. They're challenging the Beatles to a hair pulling contest, I think. I could swear Jackie Coogan and Skippy were in that group.
But it wasn't a total failure. While in America, the Stones got a chance to record at Chess Records and met some of the electric blues greats who had recorded there, including Muddy Waters. It was at Chess that they laid down an instrumental piece called 2120 South Michigan Avenue, named after the address of the studios. While Keith Richards is mostly celebrated for his talents as a rhythm guitarist, the solo on 2120 South Michigan Avenue gives an early display of the blues revival that was happening amongst young Brits of the time. While the Stones were floundering in the States, one of their contemporaries was about to take America by storm. On February 9th, 1964, the Beatles debuted on The Ed Sullivan Show and brought a wave of Beatlemania to the New World. Where the Stones were mostly blues-influenced, the Beatles' sound was more inspired by pop music and rockabilly acts like Buddy Holly and the Crickets. You can hear that influence in A Hard Day's Night, which features a perfect little pop solo by George Harrison. While the British were invading the eastern seaboard, a number of West Coast American acts were finding inspiration for new sounds in the unique culture of the country's west. A Portland band called the Kingsmen released a loose, sloppy-ass take on a 1950s rock song called Louie Louie. On that song, guitarist Mike Mitchell rips out a twangy, staggering solo with all the carefree joy of an absolute amateur. This ragged sound would birth the garage rock movement and become one of the earliest progenitors of punk. Meanwhile, further down the coast, an unlikely scene was sowing some of the earliest seeds for metal. Surf rock was an upbeat genre made of loud, high-tempo instrumentals. The volume and pace of these songs captured the adrenaline rush of catching a wave. And for a few years, surf rock enraptured California. One of the greatest songs to come out of this short-lived movement is Dick Dale's Misery. Miserlou is a take on a traditional Mediterranean folk song, which Dick Dale played as loud and fast as he could. He accomplished this with a technique of wickedly fast picking called tremolo picking. This quest for noise, speed, and technique would eventually become essential to the growth of heavy metal. But while surf rock was peaking, there was something else brewing on the beaches of California. Something that would shake the world to its core. In 1963, the patent for a synthetic psychedelic called LSD expired. Countercultural leaders like Timothy Leary and Ken Kesey started to advocate for the use of this new drug. It became intrinsically tied to music through Kesey's acid tests, events where he'd dose partygoers with acid and have the Grateful Dead play long, improvised music while he flashed lights around the room. These parties helped to ferment a new philosophical consciousness, one that pulled influence from Eastern philosophy, the Beat Generation, and a budding anti-Vietnam War movement. The soundtrack to this emergent counterculture was a new take on rock and roll, fittingly called psychedelic rock. In 1966, the Byrds recorded one of the first songs of the psychedelic rock movement, 8 Miles High. Inspired by Indian classical music and John Coltrane, 8 Miles High features an astounding, fuzz-laden guitar solo by Roger McGuinn. His guitar soars beautifully for a few moments in the beginning before descending into a strange, chaotic cacophony. McGuinn's new musical experimentation was partially inspired by an LSD experience that he'd had at a Beverly Hills house party in 1965. The hosts of that party were George Harrison and John Lennon, who'd had their first experience with the drug just a few months earlier. The Beatles were profoundly impacted by their experiences with LSD, and when they returned to Britain, they did so with a new creative ethos. Their music became more avant-garde, and in 1966, they released a psychedelic masterpiece called Revolver. That album is loaded with rich, bizarre guitar textures. The Beatles encouraged engineer Geoff Emerick to break all of the rules, saying they wanted their instruments to sound unlike themselves. One of the tricks they innovated to achieve this was the reverse guitar solo, created by running the magnetic tape backward through the machine. Harrison recorded 2 reversed solos for Revolver, Tomorrow Never Knows and I'm Only Sleeping. George Harrison's reverse solo was perfect for the otherworldly sound that the Beatles had imagined on I'm Only Sleeping, but it didn't come easy. Harrison spent 5 hours laboriously tinkering to make sure the dreamy sound would come out just right. These sorts of experimental solos would become the cornerstone of an exploding psychedelic rock movement. Just a month before the Byrds released 8 Miles High, a British group called the Yardbirds dropped another contender for the first psychedelic rock song, Shapes of Things. The Yardbirds had formed in 1963 as one of the mini bands inspired by Sister Rosetta Tharpe and Muddy Waters. They would prove to be a guitar god factory, kicking off the careers of Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page, and Jeff Beck. When Beck joined in 1965, he tapped into the Indian influence that would become synonymous with psych rock. You can hear that clearly on Shapes of Things. In that solo, Beck found new sounds through the use of guitar feedback and string bends. In the liner notes of Beckology, he described creating these sounds. I loved it because it was a most peculiar sound that contrasted wildly with a plucked string, this round, trombone-like noise coming from nowhere. Between the experiments of the Yardbirds, the Beatles, and other contemporaries like Cream, the British psychedelic scene was ready to explode in 1966. But it took the arrival of an American guitarist to truly push things over the top. His name was Jimi Hendrix. After struggling to make it as an R&B guitarist stateside, Hendrix was recruited by former Animals bassist Chas Chandler, who thought he could flourish in London. Jimi Hendrix landed in London on September 24th, 1966, and just a week later, he would change the scene there forever. On October 1st, Eric Clapton's Cream were scheduled to play at the London Polyphonic. Halfway through the set, Hendrix was invited on stage. He tore into a legendary performance of Howlin' Wolf's Killing Floor, ripping solo after virtuosic solo on a song that Clapton himself was still struggling to get down. In his autobiography, Clapton remembered witnessing this momentous performance. I remember thinking that here was a force to be reckoned with. It scared me, because clearly he was going to be a huge star. And just as we were finding our own speed, here was the real thing. Over the next few weeks, rumor of Hendrix's prowess spread throughout the scene like wildfire. On November 24th, he took the stage at a venue called the Bag O' Nails in front of a packed house that included Keith Richards, Brian Jones, and Paul McCartney. A piece by Classic Rock magazine has guitarist Terry Reid remembering the show. There were guitar players weeping. They had to mop the floor up. He was piling it on, solo after solo. I could see everyone's feelings falling out. When he finished, it was silence. Nobody knew what to do. Everybody was dumbstruck, completely in shock. While these artists had been trying to emulate the blues, Hendrix had lived them. He knew the generational struggle and trauma of being black in America, and he'd cut his teeth as a sideman for Little Richard. In addition to unparalleled talent, Hendrix had a showmanship borrowed from old blues greats like T-Bone Walker. His solos had an effortless swagger, alternating between rapid runs up and down blues scales and soaring bends, creating vivid, psychedelic sound paintings. Britain got its first proper look at this style on Foxy Lady, the opening track to the UK version of his 1967 debut, Are You Experienced? Hendrix's white-hot tone was created by pairing overdrive distortion with the emergent technology of the guitar pedal. He was one of the first guitarists to put together a proper pedal board, often running his guitar through an Arbiter Fuzzface, a wah-wah pedal, and a Univibe before playing live. These forays into pedal effects inspired others in the London scene. Eric Clapton first tried out a wah-wah pedal on Tales of Brave Ulysses, recorded the same month that Are You Experienced dropped. A year later, Clapton would use that same progression for one of the most famous solos of his career, White Room. While Clapton and Cream were trailblazing psychedelic ground, another former Yardbird was about to make his mark on the British scene. 1968 saw Jimmy Page and Led Zeppelin release their debut album. That's one of the greatest guitar albums of all time, filled with lightning-fast solos like Communication Breakdown and Dazed and Confused. Zeppelin served as an intermediary, bridging the gap between Britain's psychedelic blues movement and another scene that was pushing a more traditional take on the electric blues. One of the most celebrated guitarists of that scene was Fleetwood Mac's Peter Green, whose jangly blues shine on 1969's Oh Well. Meanwhile, back in America, the old blues greats were still kicking. At the end of 1969, B.B. King released what might be the greatest moment of his career, a new take on an old standard called The Thrill Is Gone. The string orchestra that provides a bed for B.B. King's soloing is a mark of a world that was ready to accept the guitar solo as a higher kind of artistic expression. By now, the American and British worlds had fully collided. Ground zero for that collision was 1967's Monterey Pop Festival. That landmark show saw America get its introduction to The Who and its reintroduction to Jimi Hendrix. Hendrix's set culminated in one of rock music's most lasting images, Jimi Hendrix burning his guitar in ritualistic sacrifice after an explosive rendition of Wild Thing. With the hippie movement in full force, late 60s America became fertile breeding ground for some of the greatest ever to pick up the guitar. Frank Zappa debuted an esoteric, weird and wild playstyle. John Fogerty created swampy tones. Mike Bloomfield picked up the Chicago blues torch. Duane Allman spoke for the South. And Neil Young sowed the seeds for punk and grunge on Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere. Young's approach relied less on insane runs and more on milking notes for tone and emotion. This is clear on Down by the River, where he pulls more feeling than would seem humanly possible out of a single repeated rhythm. By the end of the decade, Hendrix had returned to New York City, where he recorded one of the finest solos of his career, and one of the finest solos ever recorded, All Along the Watchtower. On that song, Hendrix used his sound painting techniques to transform Bob Dylan's contemplative lyrics into a piece of apocalyptic protest music. The solo on All Along the Watchtower perfectly captured the spirit of the 60s. It was technically experimental, emotionally daring, and undeniably ambitious. It felt like the sort of guitar solo that could truly change the world. In that moment, Hendrix cemented himself as the leader in the biggest era of countercultural action in American history. The climax of this era happened in August 1969, when 500,000 hippies braved a summer rain to travel to Woodstock, New York. One of the highlights of the Woodstock Music and Arts Festival came in the afternoon of the second day, when a 22-year-old Carlos Santana took the stage while tripping on acid and broke out an absolutely transcendental version of Soul Sacrifice. Then, on the final morning of Woodstock, Jimi Hendrix came out for the most monumental performance in the history of the electric guitar. "30-odd years after Charlie Christian first picked up his ES-150, the electric guitar solo had captured the attention of the world. In the years that followed, guitarists from all walks of life would try to channel the divine spirit of 1969. In doing so, they would push the medium to more ambitious territory, find all new levels of commercial success, and usher in the golden age of the electric guitar solo." Making these videos is a full-time job, and seeing as I need to put food on the table, they simply would not get made without the help of my sponsors. That's why I really want to thank Bellroy for supporting this episode. If you want 10% off anything on Bellroy.com, you can head on over to the link in the description. Bellroy is a really cool company making some of the best wallets, bags, and tech accessories out there. Personally, I've been using Bellroy's messenger bag and tech kit, and I've been loving them both. They're really spacious and clever with their designs, and they're just beautiful objects. On top of that, Bellroy's products are sustainably made using eco-tanned leather and recycled polyester to reduce their carbon footprint. Bellroy are a company that really believe in sustainability and in creating quality products that will last. If you want to give them a try, you should check out the link in the description. Following that link gets you 10% off anything on Bellroy.com, and it'll also show Bellroy that you support my channel, which helps me out a ton. So go give it a shot. I really love my Bellroy bag, and I think you will too. And hey, thanks for watching.